Hey everyone, welcome back to Civics Review. Today we're going to be talking about the United States foreign policy and what exactly that is. So let's get right to it. Our objectives for this movie are 1. To define what domestic and foreign policy means. 2. What are the goals of United States foreign policy? What are we trying to do when we use our foreign policy? 3. Can we list the tools of foreign policy the United States uses? And our last objective is to identify who in our government is involved in United States foreign policy. You might already know the answer to that. So let's get to it. All right, and our first goal again is to understand the word domestic and understand the word foreign. Now, we've seen the word domestic as a vocabulary word when we were looking at the preamble of the Constitution. Remember, domestic tranquility. And so we can define domestic as existing or occurring inside of our country. Think of it as anything that's happening within our country would be domestic. So the domestic production of goods are goods made here in the United States of America. And then on the flip side, we have the word foreign. And all of us know what that word means already, but get ready to use it when we apply it to the word policy. So foreign, remember, would be the opposite of domestic, and that's dealing with or related to anything outside of our nation. Now that we have those simple definitions out of the way, we can move on to identifying what are our goals when we use foreign policy. This unit is mostly going to focus on foreign policy because in our civics class, we've been looking at the domestic issues of our government, how federal, state, and local governments operate. And now we're going to start to go outside the United States and to see how our government interacts with other governments from other parts of the world. And so we have to ask ourselves, why? Why do we get involved in other countries' affairs? Why do we care if another country suffers or does well? What's the purpose of our foreign policy? And why is the United States so hands-on with other nations? All right, if you got something to write with, write this down. The number one goal of U.S. foreign policy is the safety and security of the United States. So we might get involved with another country to prevent some kind of disaster from befalling the people here in the U.S. Now I know what you're thinking. How can this happen? Well, let's say there's a country somewhere in the world that is allowing terrorists to hide out in their nation. They're okay with these citizens living in their country as long as they don't threaten their government and their nation. And they're allowing them to sort of plan and prepare attacks against other nations, and there's like, that's fine, that's okay, we don't care as long as it's not us. Well, this could be a problem for the United States. If they are continuing, if this mystery nation is continuing to harbor these terrorists that could attack people in the United States, it might be a goal of a United States foreign policy to get involved in that nation and say, hey, we don't support this because it could be a danger to us in the future. Now, in a close second that you can write down in your notes is the other goal of foreign policy that's most likely used is economic prosperity. If we can start a trade or a negotiation with another country that benefits the people, it reduces the prices of a common good we might buy, say like oil, which we don't produce here in the United States, or we don't produce very much of. And if we can use our foreign policy to befriend another nation and to get a better deal on prices, that's going to benefit the economic prosperity of all the citizens involved. And that might be a reason for getting involved in foreign affairs, especially if this nation that produces oil for us is having trouble with another nation. They're being bullied by another nation. Well, the United States might step in and protect them in order for them to receive the economic prosperity. I would say that the next three goals of foreign policy that we're going to write down in our list are kind of tertiary. They're not the main focus of foreign policy, but they're just sort of like the icing on the cake. And so we like to spread democracy. We've studied a lot about what a democratic society looks like here in civics. Remember, that's we the people. We have the power, we vote, we choose our leaders, we're very involved in our government. And we want to spread that kind of democracy to other nations. We don't like dictatorships where people are oppressed. Generally, those countries breed situations which could be dangerous for all Americans. And so the more countries that have democracy, the more countries that allow freedom of the press and free speech, the more we think we'll benefit as a nation. Number 4 would be promoting human rights. Again, these are your freedoms that we take kind of for granted here in the United States. Many countries don't have them. And so we want to promote countries that support human rights. So if your nation is supporting free speech and freedom of the press and having voting and pollings and things like that, then we are more likely to promote that nation and get involved with them in a good way. Something that's been on the forefront of what's happening in the world today is improving the conditions of the nations around the world. The United States is very well off. If you've ever traveled to another nation, you might have noticed that some of the facilities aren't as nice as they are in the United States. Cleanliness, the way people take care of themselves. And so the last goal of foreign policy is actually to improve the health and safety all around the world. If people are getting sick because their nation doesn't have the medical technology or the knowledge of how to contain a sickness or disease, that could spread to other nations, including the United States. So one of our goals is to improve health and safety all over the world so that we don't have to provide aid for them in the future. Kind of that old adage, if you teach a man to fish, he'll learn how to feed himself. So if we teach other countries, here's how we take care of things medically, or here's how we improve infrastructure in your country, then they'll learn how to do that on their own and eventually will not need our help in the future. And so their problems won't come over into the United States and affect the safety and security and economic prosperity of other citizens here. Okay, so great. We have the goals of foreign policy, but how do we influence other nations other than just straight up attacking them and hitting them over the head with something? What are the tools that we can actually use? So in your notes, under tools of foreign policy, the number one thing, believe it or not, the United States tries to do is use diplomacy. And diplomacy is a fancy schmancy word meaning to talk things out and to be peaceful when dealing with other nations. So let's say we have a goal as the United States for our foreign policy, which is to promote human rights. And there's a nation that is denying human rights to their citizens. So in this nation, maybe if you say something bad against their government, they'll kill you. And so as the United States, we would love to promote human rights. What will we do? So our tool to try and convince somebody that human rights is something that their nation should pursue would be diplomacy. Does your nation need assistance in developing human rights? Do you need an example? Could we help in any way? We would use diplomacy first and foremost in almost all situations. And that's generally the same in life. If you have a problem with somebody outside of your home or even inside your home, which would be domestic, the first thing generally most people would try and do is to talk it out. But we have other tools that we can use. Another tool the United States likes to use a lot is money, and then we call that financial aid. So let's say there's a nation that says, we want to give the United States economic prosperity by trading an item that we make very cheaply to the United States so that they can purchase it and in return give us money. We want to help that nation out. They don't have the infrastructure maybe to make these items in the quantities we desire, and so we might just say, here, take some money, build some factories, and then in return, you're going to produce with those factories things we need. And so we actually give billions of dollars to other nations. It's kind of mind-boggling when you think of all the problems we have in the United States and how that money could be best used here in the United States. We actually end up sending a lot of those dollars outside of the country to help other nations. But remember, we always have a goal. It's not just for free will to say, here's some money, enjoy it. There's always a goal. We want to keep the U.S. safe. So sometimes we send money, military aid, to countries that are defending us against terrorism, like Israel. We send them billions every year, and it's mostly for defense. We also send money to other nations for economic purposes. If you look at Ethiopia here on this list, most of their money is blue, which means it's not for military use. Now, Ethiopia has problems with drought. When it doesn't rain there for long periods of time, many people starve. Many people try to leave the country to find another nation that has food, and they bring with them sometimes their problems, or they share diseases, and that starts to ripple effect all across Africa. And so the United States sends hundreds of millions of dollars every year to help them develop their agriculture, to help them develop their medical technology, to help them help themselves, so that their problems eventually don't make their way to the United States. Now, another tool the United States has in foreign policy is what we know as economic sanctions. I love this one. So if diplomacy and foreign aid aren't really working, our suggestions, our money is not really helping a situation in another country, sometimes what we do is, in order to dissuade a country from doing something we don't want them to do, like we don't want nations to take away human rights, and we don't want governments to oppress their people. But sometimes our diplomacy, our foreign aid is not enough to change their minds. What the United States can do is simply say, we're not going to trade with you anymore. We're not going to buy your stuff. We're going to go somewhere else, and we're going to buy that other country's stuff. And you're going to see what it's like in your country when we stop buying your stuff. So good luck with that. And if, by the way, if you want us to start buying your stuff again, maybe you should listen to some of the suggestions, or maybe you should stop doing some of those things we don't like countries to do. It's almost as if like your parents were to say, I'm not going to give you any more allowance until you start doing better in school. And some of you guys, you wouldn't care. You would say, well, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. But others of you might go, is it worth it? Should I maybe just listen to them? You might hold out for a week or two, and then you realize, I really need this money. I need to get some things that I want. So I guess I'll do better in school, and then that way the money will come back to me. Okay, finally, this is the one tool that most students already anticipated when we started this unit, is military intervention, because this is what makes the headlines in the papers. This is what's exciting on TV and movies, is when we see the U.S. use their very powerful military. And so if a country does not listen to diplomacy, ignores our economic sanctions, is not affected by our foreign aid, or us withdrawing our foreign aid from that nation, if no tool seems to be successful in getting a country to do what we suggest for them to do in the best interest of our own nation — remember, the number one goal of foreign policy is United States safety — if a country is unwilling to do what we ask them to do, sometimes finally we have to use military intervention. So this is important. It's very critical that we be very cautious with using our military. We don't want people to feel like we're being a bully and going in and sort of changing countries just because we're pointing a gun at their head. But sometimes we have to do this. We use our military a lot in the Middle East, where they harbor terrorism. We're worried that other attacks will happen on our nation, like after 9/11. And so sometimes when these countries aren't listening to our suggestions, or they're really putting the clamps down on people's human rights and there's nothing else we can do, sometimes we have to be involved militarily. And I like to star this in my notes, is to say this is usually the last resort. This is not our first choice in foreign policy, is to just start dropping bombs on people's head. Okay, usually it goes in the order of diplomacy or foreign aid, and then we use economic sanctions, and we use that for a long time. And then if things continue to worsen, or the safety, the direct safety of the United States citizens is a concern, we oftentimes start using a military intervention. And again, that can be anywhere from the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, the Marine Corps. All of those things could be used to carry out this foreign policy. Okay guys, that's it for now. Thanks so much for sticking to the end of my video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. We'll make more videos soon.